Everyone, good evening. I think we'd like to start the program. I know some people are going to the election night results gatherings after the program, so we'll get things moving. I'm Susan LaPerla. I'm the programming director at the library, and it's really my pleasure to welcome you all here in partnership with Elm Street Books, our local independent bookstore, to bring Jeff Benedict back to New Canaan Library. So we're really excited that he could be here, and I'm happy to see all of you as well. Jeff's latest book that he co-authored with Armen Keteyian, who unfortunately is not here with us tonight. He has been sent on assignment to India, I believe, and he left yesterday. So regretfully, he can't be here. But he's the co-author of the book with Jeff called The System, The Glory and Scandal of Big-Time College Football. That college football is more popular than ever and has attained the status of big business is an undisputed fact. But at what price to the student athletes, academic scholarships, facilities, and faculty? Every week, hundreds of thousands of fans stream into newly built mega stadiums, and tens of millions more watch the action on television. Billions of dollars from television deals flow, pushing up the salaries of top coaches and team budgets. And yet, behind the dazzling success and hype of college football, a host of troubling issues exist, not the least of which involve the young student athletes. Investigative journalist Armen Keteyian and Jeff Benedict conducted more than 500 interviews in researching and writing the system. The result is a thought-provoking and in-depth look at both the glory and the disgrace behind collegiate football. I'll tell you a little bit about Armen. He is a CBS News correspondent based in New York and the lead correspondent for 60 Minutes Sports, which is on Showtime. He's a contributing correspondent for 60 Minutes. He's an 11-time Emmy Award winner, and he's widely regarded as one of the finest investigative journalists in the country. He's the author and co-author of 9 previous books, including Money Players and Raw Recruits. Armen and his wife and family, his daughters, lived in New Canaan for 25 years before moving to Fairfield recently. Jeff Benedict is one of the country's top investigative reporters. He published his first book, Public Heroes, Private Felons, Athletes and Crimes Against Women, during his first year of law school. He's a special features contributor for Sports Illustrated and the author of 10 critically acclaimed books, including Pros and Cons and Out of Bounds, and Poisoned, the true story of the deadly E. coli outbreak that changed the way Americans eat. His essays and articles have appeared in the New York Times, Newsweek, and the Los Angeles Times, among other publications. Jeff is a native of New London, Connecticut, and is a familiar face in New Canaan, having spoken here at the library twice in the past for his previous best-selling books, The Mormon Way of Doing Business and Little Pink House. So please join me in welcoming Jeff back to New Canaan Library.
Thank you very much. And I'm really sorry that Armen couldn't be here with me tonight. We were best friends long before we did this project together. In fact, Armen is the one who kind of got me started in writing almost 20 years ago when I was a student at Northeastern University. And Armen was a correspondent at World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. One day, I was working at a think tank at the university, and we did a lot of sports research. And one day we got a phone call. It was Armen, and I didn't know who he was. And he called me and said he was working on a story for ABC on the University of Tennessee's football players. A group of them had been arrested in a gang rape, and he asked me to do some background research for a piece he was producing for the news that week. And I did that, and then I guess I did an okay job because he called me again on another story he was working on. And anyways, eventually, about a year later, I decided to write a book, was too naive not to know that you don't just wake up and write a book one day. And I didn't have an agent, I didn't know how to sell it. And I figured Armen owed me a favor because I'd done a couple for him. So I called him, and we weren't really friends at that point, but I told him that I'd written this book about athletes and violence against women. And I said I was trying to get it published, and he said, well, why don't you let me take a look at it first? And so I sent it to him, and he was kind enough to read it. And he said, you know, it's really good. You need an agent. And long story short is he introduced me to his agent, and his agent became my agent. We sold the book, and I got into book writing. And I graduated from law school, but I stuck with book writing, and we've been friends ever since, but we'd never really worked together. And a couple years ago, when I was doing features for Sports Illustrated, and he was now at CBS Evening News, we collaborated on a story that I had pitched to the magazine about college football and crime. And it was such a big undertaking. We wanted to do criminal background checks on every team in the top 20, top 25. So it was the Sports Illustrated's preseason top 25. That's a lot of players. It was about 1,500 to 2,000 background checks we had to perform. And my editor signed off, and I said, you know, can I get a friend to come in and do this with us, because this is going to be too much for one guy. And so I introduced my editor at the magazine to Armin, and Armin loved it, and so he convinced his producer at the Evening News, and pretty soon CBS Evening News and Sports Illustrated partnered for the first time in the history of the network or the magazine. And Armin and I spent 6 months on the investigation, and we did a cover story called College Football and Crime. It was a great project, and it led us to do a follow-up, which was a second collaboration between the magazine and the network on gangs in high school sports, high school football in particular. And we were doing a lot of joint reporting in Los Angeles. And one night we were in a hotel room in LA. This was in the fall of 2011, so two years ago from right now. And I remember the night. We were sitting in a room in the hotel. We were in Armin's room. He was sitting at the desk, and I was standing over his shoulder, and we were going over notes. And I said to him, you know, we really ought to do a book on college football. We've been doing this now for a year. And he was like, yeah, we kind of know more about this than anybody because we've been so deep in it. And most of what we were learning was never going to end up on CBS and was never going to end up in the magazine. And a lot of it was fascinating. And so he was like, we should. And I said, we should call it The System. And he's like, the system, it's the system. And we just started talking back and forth. And pretty soon Armin's sitting there writing out these diagrams on a piece of paper like they were boxes, like blocks. And we started filling them in, like what are the positions that make the system of college football work? And obviously head coach was first. And then we thought we got assistant coach and graduate assistant, athletic director, college president, star player, high school recruit, high school coach, booster, tutor. You know, pretty soon we had like 25 titles that filled all these boxes. And we thought these are the people who make the system of college football work. It's the machinery of the system. And that's how this started, this process 2 years ago. We started talking to our agent about it, and we set out really early. Our thought was if we could go around to the different major conferences in college football, and if we could convince 2 coaches to let us shadow them, and then some assistants, and then each person that was in one of those boxes. So Armin went after Nick Saban at Alabama, and I went after Mike Leach at Washington State, and then we had our 2 coaches. They both said yes, and so Armin was off to Alabama, I was off to Washington State. And then we went after assistants, and pretty soon, before we were done, Armin was in Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, LSU, and I was at Washington State, Oklahoma State, BYU, and Tennessee. And we started looking at the map going, we got to make sure that we have at least one person or team from each of the major conferences. And we also, if we're looking at a map of the United States, we don't want it to be imbalanced because we want college football fans everywhere to get into this. So we were careful to make sure we had programs from each conference, but also from each geographical region. And we signed a contract that Christmas 2011, and on January 1, we were off and running. And we basically divided up the programs and the teams. And Armin went and did his programs, and I went and did mine. And to be honest with you, we were so busy that I never looked at anything that Armin wrote, and Armin never looked at anything that I wrote until we were done. We just didn't have time. And at the end, we kind of traded chapters. And I gave him a pile, I mean, it's by email, but I mean, I emailed him a bunch, and he emailed me a bunch. And truthfully, there wasn't much editing that we did to each other, again, partly because we didn't have enough time, but also because there was a lot of a mutual respect and admiration for each other and for what we were doing. And I wish Armin were here, because what we would tell you together, we said this on NPR and a couple other places where we've been interviewed together, is that there's a risk in close friends doing a project like this, and the risk is you ruin your friendship, because this is intense. What we did was incredibly intense, and it was, if you saw the miles that we racked up traveling back and forth to Pullman and Provo and Tuscaloosa and Los Angeles and Stillwater and Baton Rouge and Pensacola and Columbus and Ann Arbor, it just went on and on and on. And it's easy in those situations. There's so much that comes up to get mad at each other, you get frustrated, you don't have the same writing style. Armin doesn't write like me, and Jeff doesn't write like I do. And it's just the way it is. And the best thing about this is when it was over, we're much better friends than we were when we started, and we were really good friends when we started, but we're more like brothers now. I slept in Armin's house. I don't know, Armin's wife is here, Dee Dee. I got my own room up there, right? And Armin's, yeah. And Armin slept in our house a bunch of times working on this project, and whenever he comes, he's like family. Our kids love him, my wife loves him, and when I go to Armin's house, I feel the same way. And that is rare in this business. That does not happen. I've only collaborated with someone one other time in my life, and it was a total disaster, and I vowed I'd never do it again. And that was like 15 years ago. And well, I did it. And I don't know if I'll ever do it again, but this was a great, great project. I'm just going to share a couple of anecdotes from the reporting and some of the things that Armin and I came across. I'm going to read you one brief passage from the book and take some questions. And I'm going to try to mix this up so that I can share some of Armin's things, because he's not here, because we really did divvy things up, and we were kind of on our own. But it was actually Armin's idea that I call Mike Leach. He was going to call Nick Saban at Alabama, and he said, you should see if you can get Mike Leach. Now, for those of you who don't know Mike Leach, just a few years ago, he was the #1 college coach in the United States. He was voted that by his peers because he took a team, Texas Tech, that had no business, competing for the national championship. He took them all the way to #2 and knocked off Texas when they were undefeated in #1. And for that, he was voted Coach of the Year by his peers, and this was in 2008. He was on top of the world, literally. At the end of the season, Scott Pelley from 60 Minutes called and said, we want to profile you on 60 Minutes. The Texas Tech signed him a new contract of millions of dollars. I mean, the New York Times Magazine did a big profile on him. It was just, it couldn't get any better. Even Matthew McConaughey, who's a Texas guy, started showing up at Texas Tech games just to hang out with Mike Leach. I mean, and the guy who made the television show Friday Night Lights asked Mike if he'd cameo in it. Even George Bush invited Mike to the White House after he won that game against Texas, because President Bush was so impressed, he just wanted to have time with Mike Leach. And so here's a guy who's like riding this incredible wave in 2008, and the very next year he gets fired. And it wasn't because they were losing games, because they were winning games, and they went to another bowl game. And for people who don't know the story, you go, how could that happen? And the reason was because at the end of the season in 2009, they're going to another bowl game. He had a run-in with Craig James' son. Craig James, the ESPN analyst, has a son, Adam, who plays on Texas Tech's team. He's a wide receiver. He's not a starter, because they have guys like Michael Crabtree on their team. But James is on the team, and he and Leach don't get along very well. And leading up to the bowl game, they're having a practice. And the night before, Adam James had gotten a mild concussion at the end of practice, hit his head. And when he came off the field, he grabbed one of the trainers and said, I hit my head, I got a headache. The trainer brought him in and gave him a standard concussion evaluation test and deemed he had a mild concussion based on his answers to the questions. And he told the kid to report back to the trainer in the morning, and the team doctor will give you a more thorough exam. So the next morning he comes in, and the doctor does a more thorough exam and confirms the earlier diagnosis. Yes, mild concussion. Not severe, but mild enough that you can't practice for 7 days, you can't put your pads on. But the protocol in this situation is you're supposed to show up at practice in team dress, and you're supposed to walk the track. And, you know, nothing strenuous, but you got to walk the track, you got to dress right, and you got to be part of the team. Well, he shows up for practice that day, but he comes in late, almost a half an hour late. And when he does come in, he's wearing a baseball cap backwards, sunglasses, a kind of raggedy T-shirt, blue jeans, and he's kind of, you know, nonchalantly walking around the field. And Leach looks at the trainer and says, "Why is he late?" And the trainer says, "I don't know. He just got here." "Why is he wearing sunglasses?" "Probably because he has a mild concussion." So at that moment, this is Leach finding out for the first time that his player's got one. And Leach is angry because he's had lots of run-ins with this kid in practice, disciplinary problems. He's thrown him out of practice numerous times in his couple of years on the team. In fact, there's video you can look at on YouTube of Mike using very colorful four-letter words as nouns, adjectives, and verbs as he throws this kid off the practice field for misbehavior during practice, just kind of screwing around. They're getting ready for a bowl game, and so Leach is mad, and he tells the trainer, basically, he says, "Get him out of here," and put him in a place that's really dark and isolate him. Now, I can't really tell you what he said. You have to read the book because it's four-letter words, but that's what he told him. And so the trainer, and he tells the trainer, "And tell him I said that." So the trainer takes this kid and brings him to what has been described as a shed. It's actually like an equipment shed. It's brand new. It's not like a shed in your backyard, but it is portable. It has a pull-down door you can drive a little four-wheel vehicle through. Inside it has blocking dummies. It's got water coolers, the big ones for the ice, and some other stuff. And the trainer puts him in there, but they take everything out. They take out anything that he could sit on, they remove. And they tell him, "You got to stay in here for the duration of practice, and you have to stand up." And then he turns the lights off and closes the door. So he's in there for an hour and 40 minutes. And while he's in there, you know, he's got one of these, because every kid does. You might wonder why he had one at practice, but he did. And he starts texting his dad. Craig says, "You'll never believe where I am. And Coach Leach doesn't believe that I have a concussion. And I'm locked in a shed." And so Craig naturally gets worked up, I think like most fathers would. And anyways, at the end of practice, he's let out and goes home. The next day there's no practice. The day after that he comes, they practice at the stadium because they're getting ready to go down to San Antonio for the game. And the trainer says, "Well, what do you want me to do with Adam?" Said, "Same thing you did last time." So now they're in a different location. They put him in a media room, which is under the stadium. This is where all the journalists go after the games for the press conference. It's a bigger room. It's about half the size of this, or a third. They take the chairs out, so there's nothing in there but like a couple of wall monitors and a little closet, and I mean little, that has a bunch of electrical equipment in it, wires and modems and stuff like that. And the trainer says, "Don't go in that room. Like, don't go in the closet, but stay in here." Same deal, right? And he leaves. Well, this time, the kid goes in the electrical closet, closes himself in, and makes a video. And he records himself, you know, locked in the electrical closet. And texts his dad. And this time his dad's at dinner with his mom, and his mom is ripped, like she's had it. Enough. She says, "We're going to do something about this. We're going to do it now." And so they call the chancellor of the university, who's at a wedding for the governor of Texas's son, is having a big wedding. This is the current governor of Texas, the one who ran for president. And you imagine this: you're at his son's big wedding, and all the bigwigs in Texas are there, and you get this call from Craig James, who's an ESPN football commentator and whose son is on your team, and he says, you know, he basically says, "My son's been locked in a closet twice, and the coach said, you know, F this and F that, and blah, 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 and we've had it. And we want something done about it now." And so the chancellor's like, "Holy mackerel," and so he calls Coach Leach, and Coach Leach basically tells him to stuff it, you know. And so now you're going, okay, we got a parent over here who's not just anybody, who's on TV every night, and we got the most popular coach in the country over here. This is like two gladiators that are going to dig their heels in, And so the chancellor's trying to make a way out of it. And bottom line is, Armin and I thought it would be a great idea to open the book with this, because it's a story that anybody who follows college football knows. But we thought if we could get beneath what people know, which is just the surface stuff, and find out what really went on here. And so that's where we opened the book. That was Armin's idea, and I ran with it and got to interview Craig, and I did probably 40 interviews with Mike Leach. And when you interview Mike, it's not an interview. It's like a 5-hour conversation. And sometimes they get over at 3 or 4 in the morning. And I'm not kidding you. We closed more than one restaurant in Pullman, Washington, because we were like the only ones there. And the owner's like, okay, guys, we got to send the staff home here. But Mike will just go and go and go. And this is something he's just as passionate now as he was then. And that led us to Washington State. So while I'm doing Mike, Armin's down in Alabama following Nick Saban. And the interesting thing is, Nick Saban and Alabama are on their way to winning a national championship last year. And so some of this is luck. Now, not entirely luck. I mean, Las Vegas kind of gave them good odds to win it last year, but you know how that goes. You never know. But it was great to have Armin on the ground in Tuscaloosa while Alabama was marching to a national championship. And I'm out in Pullman following Mike Leach's first year at Washington State, and they can't win a game. And we're calling each other back and forth, reporting what we were seeing. And it was a remarkable process. And it was sort of like that through this whole thing. And I remember one night, Armin had gotten permission from a little school in Baltimore called Towson. He'd gotten permission to go to Towson and ride on their plane, because Towson had kind of made the deal with the devil. They were going to go down and play LSU, who's ranked number 2. And Towson's, not only are Towson not ranked, they're not even, I mean, they don't play schools like that. And there's a reason, because people get hurt. And, but LSU offered them $500,000 just to come down and play a game. That's a lot of money when you're a little school like Towson. Plus you're on national TV. You know, the whole country gets to watch you. And so it's a great recruiting tool for the university to go out and get, you know, players to come. And there's a lot of reasons why schools like Towson say yes every year to getting their heads handed to them once a year. But what Armin was watching for was like, what do the players think of this? Like, you're going to go up against guys that are way bigger, way faster, way stronger, better coached, and it's the SEC against, you know, it's David and Goliath. And it turned out, he got talking to the athletic director, and the athletic director admitted he was worried that some of his players might really get hurt, seriously hurt. But we need the money, we need the exposure, we need all this. So Armin's going to ride on the plane from Baltimore to LSU. He's going to see what it's like. He's going to go in the locker room. He's going to ride the bus over with the team to the game and watch all the LSU fans and their little kids giving them the finger and everything else as they ride in. I mean, these kids are 5 years old, and they're just following their dad's example. That's what they do. And they're, you know, swearing and yelling stuff at the team as they come in. And then you go in the locker room. And what does the coach say to the kids to get them ready to go out? And the same night that Armin was doing that in Baton Rouge, I was in, of all places, Stillwater, Oklahoma, which I had never been to in my life. And I went there with T. Boone Pickens, the billionaire oil and gas man. He's our booster. We have a booster in the book. He's one of the most important cogs in the system. It's the guy with the money. And T. Boone Pickens has given $250 million to Oklahoma State athletics. It's the largest endowment in the history of collegiate sports. It's never been done. Probably a long time before it stopped, although Phil Knight is right there at Oregon. But we had asked Boone, I said, Boone, would you let me follow you? I just want to follow you through a weekend. In other words, I want to come to your office in Dallas on Friday, and I want to see what's it like to be Boone on a home weekend. And he said yes. And so I flew to Dallas, and I went to his office. He runs a big hedge fund there. And I got to his office, and it's all orange. It's all Oklahoma State Cowboy stuff. The stadium's called T. Boone Pickens Stadium. It's him. And here's a guy who's, 80 plus years old, and at 3 o'clock, I'm not kidding you, they gave me a schedule from 6:05 that morning to the end of the game on Saturday night. And on his Friday before the game, it's like in 10-minute increments, it's all listed out what he's doing and exactly when and where. And at 3 o'clock, he's leaving the office. And I mean, he's leaving the office. Like, I'm chasing this guy. He's running out, and he drives himself to his private jet at Love Field. And he says, "You're riding with me." So okay, I jump in the passenger seat, and he drives as fast as he lives. Just flying through the streets of Dallas, breaking the speed limit everywhere, pulling out in front of people. And I'm buckled, and we get to the Love Field, and he presses the code, and we open the gate, and then there's his jet, and some people waiting for him, and because each week at a home game he brings guests, and he flies them up on his plane, and we go to a ranch that he owns in the Panhandle of Texas. His ranch is as big as Connecticut. It is absolutely the biggest piece of real estate you've ever seen that one person owns, and he has this enormous estate in the middle of the ranch. And he's got a helicopter, a plane, and a bunch of staff that work there. This is his routine on game day, weekend. You go to the ranch, you fly in, and then you go to this incredible place, and he treats everybody to an incredibly just home-like atmosphere. He chimes the glasses before dinner. It's all home cooked by his chef. It's fish that they catch right there in the river. And just recipes that were his mom's when he was a boy. And he toasts all his friends, most of whom are his age. And for some of them, you never know, this might be their last time to see a game like that. And he says some incredibly thoughtful things. And then he serves dinner, and then everybody goes into this movie theater and watches college football in the theater. And then we go to bed, and in the morning, he said, "Let's go for a ride." And he put me in his four-wheeler and drove me around and showed me his oil wells and his minerals, and he's got it all going there. It's incredible. And then you get back on the jet and you fly to Stillwater and you watch a football game. And when you get to the game, his suite is on the 50-yard line. And, you get in there and it's filet mignon and sauteed spinach. And I'm thinking, this is football. I mean, who watches football like this? And so when we got done that night, this is the same night that Armin's down watching Towson play LSU. And so I come out of this situation with Boone, and as soon as it was over, I called Armin from from Stillwater, and I said, "You're not going to believe what I saw this weekend." I said, "I got to just tell you what just happened." And I'm like describing it all, and he goes, "Okay, well, I got one for you." He goes, "I just left the LSU game, and you're not going to believe what happened down here. Towson almost won," and he's like screaming about all this stuff. And so this was our experience working on this book, and it was. And sometimes it was the funnest thing you could do as a journalist. And we had a lot of nights where we'd call and laugh and share those kind of stories. And then there were other nights we'd call each other and with really sad stories, because the book isn't all fun and glory. There's some chapters in here about hostesses. These are the girls that the universities use to lure in the players. The second chapter in the book is called The Closer. And it's basically this situation. It's if you think about it, 17-year-old boys are being recruited to go play college football. They're the best athletes in the country. And if you're one of those guys, you get invited to a series of universities. There's a limit on how many you can visit, but you get visited, and when you go, they're doing everything they can to convince you to come here instead of there. And so the first thing a 17-year-old boy who's a football player sees when he gets there is a beautiful face. And he stays with that beautiful face through the whole weekend. He spends way more time with a girl than he does with any coach. And that girl is called a hostess. She's his escort. And if you look at her job description, the job description is pretty benign. It just says, her job is to show them around the university and make sure they get to their appointments on time and show them the different buildings and keep the schedule. But that's not really the deal in college football. And there's a reason that they pick girls that are beautiful and that are sexy and that are 4 years older than a 17-year-old boy. And so a juvenile, by law, this kid is on a date for 2 days with a gorgeous adult who knows the ropes and shows him the ropes. And the enticement is often not sexual, but it's the promise that is what you get if you come. That's the lure. If you come here, this is what you get. And it's a powerful one. And so the selection of the hostesses is a really important thing. It's why coaches at some schools actually get involved in the picking process. And so we went to Tennessee and we followed Lacey Pearl-Earps, who was nicknamed the closer by the coaching staff at Tennessee because she could close the deals with the #1 recruits. And Lacey got trapped in a scandal that the NCAA investigated at Tennessee because there was a claim that Tennessee was misusing their hostesses by sending them to high school games, which they're not allowed to do. Tutors, I mean, hostesses have a lot more leeway than coaches. They can call a player as often as they want. There's no limit on how many times a hostess can call a recruit. And she could talk to him from 10 o'clock at night till 4 in the morning. And they will do that on Skype. You kind of know what's going on here. But that's what they do. A coach can't do that. He has a limit to how many calls he can make and how much contact. Hostess can have unlimited contact, but the one thing they can't do is they can't drive across state lines and go to a high school football game wearing Tennessee colors and clothes and posters and directly recruit a player. That's something they can't do. And Lacey Pearl-Earps and one of her colleagues did that, where they went from Tennessee to South Carolina to a high school that is filled with kids that are going to go to Division I schools. And they got caught because there were some pictures taken that ended up on the internet, and one thing led to another, and the NCAA found out about it, and they started an investigation. Well, the thing is, the reason Lacey went there is because Lane Kiffin, who was the coach at Tennessee, told her to go there, which he should have never done. And not only did he tell her to go there, he gave her money to go there, which he definitely shouldn't have done. And so she took the money and she went because she was trying to be a good hostess. And these boys signed with Tennessee. And that's why she's got the nickname. Well, when the investigation started, Lane Kiffin called her and said, you know, my dad, he said, don't worry about this. This will pass. My dad had a saying about this stuff. It's called the 48-hour rule. In 2 days, the media will forget about it and life will go on and you'll be fine. Just don't worry about it. Well, that didn't happen. It went on for weeks. And first it was in Sports Illustrated, then it was in the New York Times, and it just kept snowballing. And when that happened, Kiffin and his staff basically threw the two hostesses under the bus, acted like they had nothing to do with it, didn't know why they were there, and that they should have never gone there. And the girls got fired by the University of Tennessee. They lost their jobs with the athletic department, and they were blackballed. And then there were all these reports that these girls like Lacey, they were loose, and they were sleeping with players and doing all this stuff, which that actually wasn't true. And so we spent a whole chapter with Lacey to find out what really happened and how hostesses work. We did the same thing with tutors at Missouri because we found a case where a football player had sexually assaulted his tutor. And tutors are the other key cog in the system because there's no way college football freshmen can get through their freshman year of football without tutors because they spend more time on football than they do on anything else, including all their academic studies and classes combined. Doesn't add up to how much time they're expected to work out, train, and practice. So they have tutors. And when you put guys with all that testosterone and they're young and they're handsome and you put them in individual quarters with young, pretty girls who are their tutors, things happen. And at Missouri, they called it Friends with Benefits. And Friends with Benefits was a program that meant the athletes could have sex with the tutors. And that's what they were doing. And it was consensual. It wasn't criminal, it was consensual. The problem is not all the tutors want to do that. Some of the tutors are there because they just need the $7.50 an hour and they're smart and they're trying to get through college. And those are the girls that are at risk because the players start thinking they're all like this and we can do with any of them what we do with some of them. And that's what happened to Teresa Brackle, and she's the girl we profiled in the system, who woke up one night to the running back that she tutored for 2 years who was in her bed. And, you know, bad things happen. And Teresa went to the cops, and the cops went to the running back's house, and he got arrested, and he claimed he didn't know anything about it, which was a lie. He got caught. He went to trial, and a jury in Missouri convicted him, and he went to prison. And this was a guy who was headed to the NFL. And so we have that story in here. That's what we try to do with the book is to take you through the different elements of the system. I'm just going to read you one thing. It's my favorite story in the book. And then I'm going to tell you a funny Armin joke and then take some questions. Okay, so we're split up. And one of the schools I did was Brigham Young University. And here's the thing that we did with BYU was At BYU, we wanted to play. It wasn't that we wanted BYU, but we were looking for a blue chip underclassman. So a football player who's good enough after his junior year to declare eligible for the draft. And there aren't many guys that fit that, so we didn't have a big pool to pick from. But we knew that Brigham Young University had a linebacker named Kyle Van Noy, who after his sophomore year was already being talked about as an NFL draft pick. So we knew that at the end of his junior year, which was last year, the year we're going through this, that he's going to have a big decision to make. So we called Brigham Young and we said, look, we'd like permission to shadow Kyle Van Noy, the linebacker, through his junior year, because we want to watch him go through the decision process. We don't really care whether he goes into the draft or not. We just want to be able to explain to readers what's it like to be in that position and how do you make the decision? And how do you deal with the agents and all the money and all the stuff? And the guy says, well, we'll talk to Kyle first. And so they talked to Kyle, and Kyle said he was willing to at least talk to us and explore it. So then they talked to their compliance people, yes. Then we had to go to the NCAA to get permission from the NCAA. We finally got everybody to sign off, and then I fly out to meet Kyle, and I met him, and after spending a day with me, he agreed. So now we have our guy. And the season starts, and I start going to BYU to follow Kyle. First game of the year last year is BYU versus Washington State. So I got Mike Leach on one sideline and Kyle on the other. I'm doing two things at once. I'm literally running back and forth. Well, the day after the game, I get to sit down with Kyle and do a long interview. Now, here's Kyle's history that you need to know. Kyle's a kid who grew up in Reno, Nevada, and in his senior year of high school, he got arrested for drunk driving. And he got arrested right after he committed to Brigham Young University. So Brigham Young recruits him. Brigham Young recruited him and Manti Te'o together, two Mormon kids who were considered two of the best linebackers in the United States in high school. Kyle's from Reno, Manti Te'o's from Hawaii. And they both made their visit to BYU together. So you got Manti Te'o and Kyle Van Noy on the campus the same weekend being recruited. And at the end of the weekend, BYU decided they wanted Kyle more than Manti. Manti ends up going to Notre Dame, and BYU puts all its energy on getting Kyle Van Noy, and they get him. He gives them the verbal commitment, and then National Signing Day is in February, and he's going to sign on the dotted line. 2 days before National Signing Day, he gets arrested for DUI. And BYU has the strictest honor code in the country, and they actually enforce it. And so this is a problem. And it's all over the newspapers in Reno. Now, Kyle's a juvenile. It should have never been in the papers, but a guard at the jail leaked it to the news sports reporter because the guard in the jail recognized him and knew he was the most famous athlete in Reno. So here's a 17-year-old kid who's all over the news for all the wrong reasons. BYU finds out. Of course, Kyle calls up Coach Mendenhall, the head coach who recruited him, and the coach says, well, obviously you can't come here now, but, we'll release you from your commitment here. And the good news is there's 15 other schools, starting with Oregon, UCLA, Washington, Colorado, that all want you, and they'll all sign you tomorrow. And you'll play this year, but you can't play here. And Kyle says, but I don't want to go to any of those schools. I want to come here. His coach is like, well, you can't do that. And he says, well, that's what I want to do. And so the coach meets with the AD and the dean, and they come up with a plan. And the plan is Kyle will sit out a year, and if he can live the honor code for a year, and he goes through an ecclesiastical interview with his bishop and meets all the other standards of the university, in a year we'll instate him and we'll reintroduce a scholarship and he can play. But he's got to sit a year. He's got to demonstrate that he's serious. And the coach the AD is going, well, he's never going to do that. He's going to go to Oregon. We'll lose this kid. Well, so be it. So they call him and they tell him, and he says, I'll do it. So, okay. So 2 days later is National Signing Day. All the BYU kids that are going to sign are announced. And then Mendenhall at the press conference says, and we are signing Kyle Van Noy. And he reads an apology letter that Kyle wrote for letting down the people, and he admits that he was driving drunk. And it's all in there. So now it's all out there. Okay? So that's that. Now, a month goes by, and here we are. 1 month later, Van Noy went out with friends. They had alcohol. It got late. Van Noy didn't go home. He ended up on a park bench on the streets of Reno, where he fell asleep. The next thing he remembered was waking up to police sirens and flashing lights. Scared, he took off running. Officers gave chase. Trapped in an alley, Van Noy shrugged off an officer and broke free. Then from behind, he heard the clicking of a taser gun. He dropped to the ground. Before he knew it, he was in police custody for a second time in a 1-month span, this time cited for eluding an officer. He was not charged with an alcohol offense this time, however, and when the authorities considered his juvenile status and the fact that he was already facing DUI charges, they opted not to bring a second case against Van Noy. Charges were dropped. And this time, the local press did not find out. Under Nevada law, the report in the second incident was sealed. Fortunately for Van Noy, no one would find out about his second arrest, especially not Coach Mendenhall. But Van Noy was uneasy. Mendenhall had given him a second chance. He felt he owed it to him to come clean, even though he knew that would likely end his football career at BYU before it started. He talked to his parents and decided to fly to Provo and confess to Mendenhall. Up until that point, I didn't want to be helped, Van Noy said, but suddenly I felt like a kid who needed help. I wanted help. He went straight to Coach Mendenhall's office. The door was ajar. He knocked, and Mendenhall looked up and grinned. "Come in, Kyle. Why are you here?" Van Noy looked away, biting his lip. The grin left Mendenhall's face as he stood and walked toward him. Van Noy's eyes welled up. So did Mendenhall's. "Kyle, talk to me. Let me help you." Van Noy took a seat, his voice shaking. He revealed every detail about the second run-in with the law. "I need help," he said. Mendenhall recalled the opening lines to a favorite speech by BYU's former president, Jeffrey R. Holland. "It is the plain and very sobering truth that before great moments, certainly before great spiritual moments, there can come adversity, opposition, and darkness. Life has some of those moments for us, and occasionally they come just as we are approaching an important decision or a significant step in our life." Mendenhall looked Van Noy in the eye and told him not to worry about the second incident. "That's why I gave you the 1-year plan," he told Van Noy. "There are no words to describe how I felt before I got to his office," Van Noy said, "and no words to describe how good I felt when he accepted me." Mendenhall and Van Noy put their arms around each other. I love that scene. Van Noy does it. He goes the next 11 months without any problems. He sits out. He's declared eligible after a year. He comes and plays his freshman and sophomore year. Last year he played his junior year. He was an All-American. He's never slipped in his time at BYU. He's never gone back. He's never had a drink. I believe if he'd gone anywhere else, his football career would have ended before now. He would have never made it to the NFL. This year he'll be a number 1 pick in the spring. Last year at the end of the Poinsettia Bowl, I got permission to be in the locker room. I was sure it was his last game because he was an All-American junior and all the scouts were ready to take him. And after the game, this was right after the school shooting here in Connecticut, and I'll never forget this. This kid is playing his last college football game, and he's the most valuable player of the game in San Diego, and everybody's chanting and yelling his name. And he's interviewed in the corner of the stadium in San Diego after the game. The whole stadium's empty. All the teams have left the field. There's like 50 diehard BYU fans in the corner of the stadium, and a television camera and a reporter, and he's interviewing Kyle about his last game. And I was there shadowing, so I'm not asking questions. I'm watching, never asking anything. And then when it's done, the fans started going, "1 more year, 1 more year." And this great scene, it's like out of a movie. He's walking through the end zone. He scored 2 touchdowns in that game on defense. On defense. One where he sacked the quarterback and then recovered a fumble in the end zone, and one where he picked off a pass and ran it all the way back. He had an unbelievable game. And he's walking through the end zone that he scored those 2 scores in. And I'm with him, and I got my recorder running, and I said, "Kyle, what are you thinking about right now?" He says, "I'm thinking about those kids back in Connecticut." He's never been to Connecticut. He said, "I'm thinking about those kids in Newtown." I couldn't believe it. I thought, I would never expect that answer. And then we went in the locker room, and the locker room was empty, except for him, the coach, and this guy named Ziggy, who's in our book. Ziggy's this African kid who didn't know how to put on a helmet, who went to BYU to study statistics. And when the football players saw this kid with his shirt off, they were like, you got to play football. He literally didn't know how to put his uniform on. And last year, he was the number 5 pick overall in the draft. He was a senior last year. He was so sad to leave BYU that he sat in the locker room after the bowl game and would not take his uniform off. The whole team was on the bus. This kid's sitting there in mud, cleats, on a stool when Kyle walked in with his coach. And I'm thinking, these two guys, the best defensive players probably in the history of this university, are both leaving. And they hugged their coach and they literally cried. And it was a great scene. We put that scene in here. And then a week later, over Christmas, I got a call at our home, and it was Kyle, and he said, I'm staying. And I was like, you're what? I'm not going to go pro. I want to graduate. I want to play my senior year. Like, I want to get the whole college experience. I'll go next year. I want to get a degree because I want kids who look at us to say, if Kyle can do this, anybody can. And so he stayed. And this year, he's going to be an All-American again. He's a great kid. Lydia and I had the opportunity, because BYU opened at Virginia this year, and we went just to watch him. We took him out to dinner before the game on Friday night in this little restaurant in Charlottesville. And it was interesting, when we walked in the restaurant, Kyle's a big guy, and he's wearing his kind of BYU sweats and stuff. And this restaurant, everyone's kind of dressed up. It's a fancy, nice place, and all organic food, lots of good wine in Charlottesville. And in walks this BYU kid, and everybody in there knew who he was. And everyone in there is a Virginia Cavalier, except Kyle. And Lydia and I, were commenting in the car, what it would be like to be that young. I mean, think about when you were in college, that you could not walk somewhere in public and not have everybody know who you are. And if you slip, then your parents are going to watch it on TV. If you screw up, your mom and dad, wherever they live in the United States, are going to watch you on television if you make one slip. And that's what that kid's lived with for 4 years. 4 years with that huge spotlight on him, just waiting for him to make a mistake. It's the system. It's a great study of American culture. College football is the biggest sport in America. It's bigger than the NFL. There are 32 teams in the NFL. There's over 120 Division I programs in college football. And, stadiums at Alabama and Michigan, 100,000 people going to games on the weekend. It's bigger. It's bigger than the NFL. I don't care what anybody says. People are incredibly passionate. Rich, young, old, white, black, doesn't matter. They're at these games, and it's more important to many people than religion. And if you see the way people get worked up over these games, it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible, and you can get swept up in it. It's an amazing thing. And there's billions, not millions, billions of dollars floating around this thing. I've talked too long. I have a lot of friends here, as Armin does, and we're both grateful that you would come out. We love this town. Armin lived here, and I have many friends here that I consider like family from New Canaan. When I did the book, The Mormon Way of Doing Business, about 8 CEOs, 5 of them live in New Canaan. And so I love coming here, and one of them's here tonight. And so it's great to come back to this town. And I thank you for giving us the time. And if there's some questions, I'll take a few, and we'll get you guys home so you can see the election results. Bob?
Yeah, you're saying it's, the billions and billions of dollars that go into this sport. And the kids arguably get a free ride, so maybe they get a couple $100,000 of value in education.
Right.
But they're chewed up by a system. Is Kyle the great exception to the system? I mean, how many of these kids get chewed up by the system, either don't get a college education or get a college education and don't go on anywhere because of the way they've gone through the system?
Kyle's an exception, and he's an exception because his coach is an exception. And I'm not going to name who this is, but since the book has come out, Armin and I have been on the road promoting, and we've gone back to a lot of the towns that we worked in while we were on the book, the football towns. And I was on a campus just a few weeks ago. I'm not going to tell you which one, but it's a big one. It's a top 20 school. And the athletic director pulled me aside, and he had just finished reading the book, and he told me, he said, off the record, he said, if I could hire one coach in the country to take over my school, it would be that guy at BYU, Bronco Mendenhall. He said, when I read those chapters on what he did with that kid at Kyle Van Noy, he goes, I don't know any other coaches who do stuff like that. He said, because we're all about winning. And he said, but that's really what it's about, because over 99% of these kids who play college football will never play pro football. It's over 99% of college football players will not play pro football. There's some who are good enough in that 1% to play pro football, but can't because their bodies are too broken to make it through their first NFL training camp. They just don't make it through. And we have a chapter about that called The Wounded. And so the truth is, it's the exception. And the idea that, well, kids are getting an education and it's free and they get room and board and that's all nice, but this is not amateur sports, and it's not what it was when those rules were made. These kids spend more time getting hit and hitting than NFL players do. They spend less time with their families than NFL players do. Kyle Van Noy, the year we covered him, which was last year, in a 365-day calendar year, he was home in Reno, Nevada 4 days. 4 days. 361 days he trained, worked out, practiced, or played. Now, there is no NFL team that does that to its players. They wear these kids out. These kids, when they leave, they're battered, a lot of them. And they have to pay for the medication, the therapy, the treatment that comes for the rest of their lives. So when you start thinking about, oh, we don't need to pay these players, look, it's not fair. The coaches are driving Beamers, living in million-dollar homes. The athletic directors are doing the same. ESPN's making billions of dollars. Nike's making billions of dollars. Everybody's getting rich on the backs of these kids. Now, I'm not saying that they ought to go to the student affairs office every Saturday and pick up their check, but I am saying that the current system is not fair. It's got to change. Because you can't have everyone else getting rich and then have Johnny Manziel get in trouble because he took a few bucks for signing an autograph, when the guy who he gave the autograph to is going to go on eBay and make $1,000 off it. Just not right.
Quick question. Sports lasts 4 years, education lasts 40 years.
Yep.
And, your book, football has turned that around, but most major, whatever college sports, besides BYU, what are the 3 schools that really get their kids education, besides the Ivies?
This will surprise you, but Washington State, where Leach is, when Leach was at Texas Tech had the highest graduation rate in the country. When he got there, they had the lowest. In 10 years, he got them to the highest. I was in a meeting last spring when he first came on the job. I got to attend a meeting where he and the coaches met with the academic advisors. The academic advisor's job is to keep the kids eligible. So they go through 100 names, where they're going name by name, and they're telling the coaches their GPAs, how many classes they're flunking, who's going to study hall. And the guy says, out of all these guys, coach, it's great news. You only got 2 guys that are right now, borderline ineligible. And Mike Leach is like, either you guys don't know what you're doing, or we got a bunch of nuns on this team and we got to get new guys here. Because he said there is no team that plays football at this level that only has 2 guys that are on the border of being ineligible. He says, you need to go back and start pushing harder, because there's no way this is accurate. And his rule is, if you're not, he kicks you off the team. He kicked 2 linebackers off the team last spring who were the only 2 guys on defense that were NFL caliber. Within a month, he booted them. And so I think Washington State is a team that takes, you might not like other things that go on there. You might not like all the swearing and the 4-letter words and all that stuff, but on the academics, they're solid. BYU is solid. I got to tell you, I'm hard-pressed after that. After that, for personal experience, I don't know, and I don't know that Armin would know either. I don't know. I wish I could tell you more, but out of the schools we looked at, I can't go deeper than that, which is probably sad.
Could you comment on the derivation of the term student-athlete?
Well, Armin changed it to athlete-student in the book. He coined that phrase when we were writing the introduction. And Armin's good with words and phrases and stuff like that. And I liked it. I thought, it's probably good, because these football players are athletes first. They're students second, if at all. In a lot of programs, they're not at all. And we published a study in our book that showed the percentage of hours that college football players now spend on football-related activities versus academic. And they have actually flipped it now. So they're spending more than 50% of their time on football-related and less than 50% of their time on academic-related activities. It's a, you know, when you follow these guys like we did, and Armin did it with players and so did I. He was following players at Michigan and Alabama, and I was doing it at BYU and Washington State. And when you see what these guys do every day, these kids, I call them kids because they're juveniles when they get there, it is rather remarkable to see how much physical demand is put on a guy. Now, granted, when you're between 18 and 22, you're kind of at the prime of your life in terms of your strength and your fitness and all that. But it's amazing what these young guys are expected to do day in and day out. And frankly, it's disturbing at times to see the pounding that some of these guys take, particularly if you're like the practice squad guys. Those guys, they're there for 4 years. Most of them never play a down of a live game. They're just there to get their bodies. And they're just pummeled day in and day out. And you got to have guys like that in order to practice this sport. And so, I don't know. I mean, Armin and I both had an evolution in the way we think about student athletes working on this book because we spent enough time with these guys. Not that we got like too emotionally attached to them, but just when you spend enough time with them, you come to appreciate what they're doing is this really isn't school. These kids are not really students. I mean, to be really honest, they're just not. I mean, yeah, they go to some classes and stuff, but they're just not really students. And it's very similar to a few basketball programs like Kentucky and Duke. And I'm not knocking academics at Duke or Kentucky. I'm just saying that these are like professional programs. And they're treated like professionals when they play and they practice. And they're expected to perform that way. And there are consequences when they don't. And there aren't many other kids in college who have that kind of pressure on them. Where there's literally 25 million people tuning in to ESPN to watch you play. That's not really a game anymore. It's a lot of pressure that most of us would not want our 18 and 19-year-old sons to be under. But that's the deal. I can take one more. Mm-hmm.
That's just a quick question. You and Armin wrote this. You talked about being in different places at different times. And I know you had a lot of researchers helping you do interviews and stuff. Yet the book has a really unified voice.
Right.
How did you get to that?
We didn't. I know. I say that jokingly because you guys will get a kick out of this, but writing it's an interesting thing that, there's all kinds of writing, right? There's novels, there's nonfiction, there's magazines. Armin writes primarily for television, and television's an art. I mean, to write for television is very, very difficult. They say the hardest writing in the world is writing commercials because you have to get the message down to literally a couple of words, right? And so that versus a book is like the other end of the extreme. And then there's all kinds of things in between that. And television's closer to the commercial than it is to the book. I primarily write books and sometimes will do magazine pieces and stuff like that. So when we started this project, it was evident early that we had really different writing styles. Now, not that we didn't know that. I've read Armin's stuff before and he's read mine, so that wasn't a shocking revelation. But it was really clear to us when we passed pages to each other, like, whoa, we're writing different things here. And when we turned them in, our editor, I'll never forget this, the first notes we got back from the editor, this is what he said. Dee, I don't know if Armin ever told you this, this is pretty funny. He says, Jeff, this is in writing, Jeff, problem, we have no idea how you feel about anything that you've written because your opinion is nowhere. Armin, your opinion is everywhere. He says, you two guys need to both move to the middle. And Armin and I are on the phone both saying the same thing. He's like, well, that's the way I write, and I'm not changing. I said, and I feel the same way. I don't want to change it either. So we just, over the process, we polished a few things, and I got to close. Actually, I was going to tell you this story. We got to end on this because this will leave you laughing. So I'll tell you this, I'm a Mormon, Armin's not, and I'm writing the BYU chapters. I didn't go to BYU. I don't even really like BYU, but those just happen to be my chapters. And so I write the BYU chapters. And when I get done, one of the best scenes in the book is when Bronco Mendenhall gets hired to be a coach at BYU. He has no business being a coach at BYU. He was their last option because everyone else said no. So they hire him. He shouldn't be there. He knows it. He's the youngest head coach in the country. And his first day on the job, he says, I got there at 6 o'clock in the morning because I was so overwhelmed. I didn't know where to start. I thought I better get there early. And he says, I walk into the empty office because the other coach had just been fired. And there's a real bad mood on the campus. The team stinks. It's a disaster. So he comes in. He's got a stack of yellow Post-its for people to call back, some Nike gear on the floor, an empty desk otherwise, and a couch. What do I do first? And he said, I got there. I hadn't slept all night. And I'll tell you this, because he didn't want me to put this in the book, but he threw up all night too. That's how nervous he was. And he comes in early, and he's so overwhelmed. You know, BYU is a religious school, and he's like, I have these huge obligations. He didn't know what to do. He says, now, I don't know how, here's what he said to me. He goes, I don't know how you're going to describe this to your readers, because most of them won't understand this if they're not Mormons, but he said, you'll get it because you are one, so I'm just going to tell you, and then you figure out how to write it. So this is what he says to me. He goes, I didn't know what else to do, so I dropped to my knees in my office, and at the couch, I had my elbows on the couch, and he said, I started praying to God for help. Send me help. And he said, I lost track of how long I was on my knees, but I know I got down there at 6 o'clock. He says, then there was this. He said, I looked up, it was 8 o'clock in the morning. I've been down there for 2 hours. And he thought, who would be here now? I got up, I opened a door, and it was Lavelle Edwards, the former coach of BYU who's in the Hall of Fame and is the 5th most winningest coach in the history of college football. They don't know each other. They do not have an appointment. And he said, I was stunned. He said, I was speechless. And Lavelle said, I just thought you might be here and come down and see you. So he invites the coach in, and they sit down, and they just stare at each other. And then finally, Lavelle says a few things, and then Bronco says, well, do you have any advice? And he goes, my advice is don't try to be me. Be you. You know, make this your program. Don't try to be me, blah, blah, blah. So he tells me that story. So I write it, basically like I just told it to you. And then I pass pages to Armin. Now, when we did this, Armin's at my house. So he's down in Virginia. We're in the kitchen. And he's just reading these, and he's standing up at the counter. I'll never forget this. He's reading at the counter. He's got his glass of wine here. He's sipping. He's reading the BYU things, and he stops. He goes, Jeff. He goes, you totally underplayed this. I said, what are you talking about, Armin? He goes, for crying out loud. He goes, you got Lavelle Edwards coming down. He said, this is like Brigham Young coming down the mountain with the golden plates. He goes, you've got to dramatize this. And I said, Armin, I said, I can't do that. He goes, then I'll do it. So he did. So he rewrote all this thing, and it was very dramatic, right? So we sent it in the way Armin wrote it. The editor went nuts. He bawled me out. Like, he calls me up. First, he has the agent call me, our agent, and the agent says, I just want to prepare you that you're going to get a call from the editor, and he has taken out that entire scene, like removed it from them. And I said, why? It's a great scene. He goes, because it sounds like you're promoting your religion. I said, time out. He goes, you can't write it like that. I said, I didn't. He says, what do you mean you didn't? I said, Armin wrote that. That is not the way I wrote it. And I said, you need to tell the editor that, because if he saw the version that I wrote, it wasn't like that. So I called Armin. I said, Armin, you need to do some lobbying here. And so Armin called up, and anyways, the scene stayed in, but we took out the Brigham Young and the mountain and the golden plates, and we went back to what we had. Thank you.